Hello everyone, welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm Brian Stuart. Well, we're continuing along in our book. We're on lesson 8 right now. We're talking about changes in family life. In this unit, you will discover changes in family life, same as the title. But what exactly does that mean? If we take a look at the pictures to warm up for this unit, we can see two different pictures. We can see a picture from a long time ago in the past. Women were working very hard in the home. Then we see a modern picture of a young woman, and she's not working in the home, she's working in an office. We can see many differences between these two pictures in terms of type of work, where people were working, what kind of clothes they were wearing, and the differences between the past and the present. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about changes in family life. We're talking about how has things changed? How have things changed from the past to the present? Let's take a look at some words that we're going to talk about. First of all, we say family life, right? What is life? Of course, life is the way a person lives. Of course, this is a little bit of a different picture, from a baby to a very old person, right? This is the life of a person. But life also means how or the way a person lives. And when we talk about how a person lives or the way in which a person lives, we can also use another word very similar that's called lifestyle. So, what is your lifestyle? What were the lifestyles of people a long time ago like? What are the lifestyles of modern people? So, yeah, sure, we can talk about life of different people, but especially when we talk about how people live, we're really talking about lifestyle. What is their lifestyle? Okay, another word we can talk about is dress. We saw that a little bit in the picture at the first slide of this lesson, right? At the first beginning of this lesson, we saw that the women were wearing different types of clothing. A dress, of course, is a type of clothing for women and girls. Men do not wear dresses. I hope men do not wear dresses. If you see a man or a boy wearing a dress, that's very strange. Maybe that's Halloween or it's a costume. But anyway, dress is typically for women and girls. Traditionally, that was the only clothing that women were dresses. However, nowadays, women don't always have to wear dresses, but they do if they want to. Okay, let's move on to our next one. Shelter. Shelter is a place to live or stay. There are many types of shelters, right? There are many types of shelters. What type of shelter do you live in? You probably live in an apartment. An apartment. That's a very common type of shelter in Korea, right? An apartment. What are some other types of shelter? Well, this looks like a house. It's a large house, right? But you can just say house. You could live in a large house, or you can live in a small house. An apartment, a house, those are typical types of shelters. But shelter can be really any building that somebody lives in or any structure. A long time ago, American Indians lived in teepees. They were like tents. A tent is a type of structure or shelter. So basically, any place that you can go inside, you can stay, and that protects you from the outside environment like rain, snow, cold, or even heat. These things protect you. It's a place to stay. They are called shelters. Okay. Before I talked about dress, now we're talking about clothing. Again, dress is a type of clothing. Clothing is just coverings that people wear. And of course, there's many types of clothing, right? I'm wearing a shirt. That's one type of clothing. You could wear a jacket. That's another type of clothing. Even the shoes on your feet, we consider that as clothing as well. These are things that we put over our bodies or on our bodies to cover us. And they protect us from nature also. We don't call the clothes shelter, even though they do the same thing, right? Clothes protect us from the environment. Shelter protects us from the environment, but they're different types of things. Clothings are coverings that we wear, that we put on our body. We wear these things during the day. We put on clothes. Put on clothes. We put on clothes in the morning and we wear clothes during the day. Okay, so in the morning you put on clothes, during the day you wear your clothes, and then at night, before you get to bed, you take off your clothes. Okay, so basically 3 types of verbs we use with clothes: put on, wear, take off. Put on clothes in the morning, or when you try clothes on in the store, you put it on. You wear clothes during the day for the whole day. At night, you take off your clothes, get ready for bed. Okay, so clothing. Another word that we're talking about in this unit is crop. What is a crop? A crop is a plant that people grow as food. Not just any plant, right? We go out into nature and we look at plants. Not all the plants we find are crops, only the plants that people grow as food. Okay, for example, what are some types of crops that we grow as food? A very common type of crop in Korea, of course, is rice. Rice is a very, very, very common type of crop all over the world. Wheat is another one. Wheat is a crop. These are types of plants that we grow for food. So any type of plant that a farmer will grow, those are called crops. And we eat them. We eat them in large numbers, okay? Of course, where do we grow these foods? We grow them on a farm. A farm is a piece of land where people grow crops or animals, right? We don't really see any crops in this picture. This is a farm, but what we do see are animals. So farm is used to grow plants, right, as food, and also animals as food. So basically, we get our food from 2 sources, right? We get our food from plants. We eat plants for food. We also eat animals for food. Where do we get those things? From a farm, okay? So it's a piece of land or an area where a farmer, right? A farmer owns a farm. They grow crops. They also grow animals. And they send those products to our stores. We buy them and we can eat something. So farms, of course, are very important to us. Okay, when it's time for the farmer to go out and gather the plants for food, right? The plants have to grow, right? They have to reach a certain stage before we can eat them. We can't eat the young plants. We have to wait till the plants grow fully, and then we can eat the plants. At that time, when is that time? It's usually in the fall. And the farmers will go out and they will harvest. They will harvest the crops. Harvest means that they will gather. Gather together means to get together. You gather together all the things. You gather the gathering of the crops. So the farmer goes out and they will gather all those crops. They will gather all the rice together. They will gather all the wheat together, or the corn, or the cucumbers, or the tomatoes. All of these types of plants, when they gather them in, that's called the harvest. It's very common you say, it's harvest time. It's harvest time. And again, that normally happens in the fall, right? In the fall, it's harvest time. The farmer will go out and gather the crops. And then we have a lot of food, okay? Okay, corn is a type of crop, right? We talked about rice, we talked about wheat, but corn is also a very common type of crop. Corn, of course, you recognize corn, right? Corn is a kind of plant with yellow seeds. Yellow seeds, and these seeds are big, right? They're very delicious too, which is used for food. So I'm sure you like corn. Of course, we all like popcorn. We can use corn to make popcorn too. But the yellow seeds we will eat as food. Let's take a look at a video. This is a farmer in his field, and he is walking through his land on his farm, and he is growing corn. You see, the corn plants are very high. They're taller than he is. And he's holding an ear of corn in his hand. An ear of corn. That's how we say, you know, one part of the plant that we take off the the whole plant, we call it an ear of corn. Now, one corn stalk will have many ears of corn. Not really ears, right? But we just call it that. So he will go through and he's checking on his crops and he's looking to see what the progress is. And maybe he broke one off to see if it's ready to eat or not. It looks like it's harvest time soon because these plants have grown so high. He will probably harvest his corn very quickly or soon. Wheat, again, is another type of crop. We've talked about rice, wheat, and corn. Here we have wheat again. Wheat is a kind of plant with grains that flour is made from. So these grains, we take these grains and we push them together. We grind them together. We grind wheat. Grind is when you push with a lot of force and you make something crumble into smaller, very small pieces, and that of course is flour. White flour, which you use to make bread, cookies, cake, all these different types of things. That is made by wheat, those different types of food. So flour is made from wheat. Wheat is a very important crop for humans. Okay, so we're talking about, it seems like we're talking about farming too much, but our main focus, of course, is how people's lives have changed, right? How has life changed from the past to the present? And this is what we're looking at here on this chart. So what has changed in family life? We can look at the past, we can look at the present. These are the two different time periods we're looking at, and we're looking at these categories. How has clothing changed in the past and to the present? How has shelter changed from the past to the present? How has food changed from the past to the present? How have these things changed? Let's take a look. Okay, so in the past, clothing. Women wore dresses, right? Dresses were very common. It was basically the only type of clothing that most women wore, dresses. If women wore something other than a dress, it would be very strange. If she wore men's clothes, that wasn't accepted. Women were only expected to wear dresses. However, nowadays, women, girls, can wear t-shirts and jeans. In fact, everybody seems to wear t-shirts and jeans now, right? That's a very common type of clothing. So, clothing didn't just change for women, it also changed for men. Men went from, very formal suits or very different types of clothing to very casual t-shirt and jeans that are very common these days. So that's how clothing has changed. What about shelter? A long time ago, most people lived in farmhouses, right? They lived on farms because you had to be close to the food that you were growing. So most people lived on farms. They lived in farmhouses. Nowadays, most people live in city houses or apartments. We talked about that before. But this looks like suburb, right? This could be a suburb. And there are many houses in the suburbs. Suburbs are just right outside the city, right? So you say city house, but right outside the city you have many suburbs, okay? And there's housing divisions out there. So a long time ago people lived in farmhouses because they had to be next to the food they were growing. But nowadays we have refrigeration, we have trucks, we have trains, we can transport food a long distance, so we don't have to live on farms anymore. Not many people are involved in farming. Fewer and fewer people are farmers. They can grow more and more food, so more and more people can do other things than farm. So people have changed where they live. Over here, food. How has our food changed? Well, a long time ago in the past, people harvested by hand. They gathered the food by hand. That's all that they had. They just had their hands and they would gather the food together. Nowadays, however, you can harvest by machine. And that kind of gets back to what we were talking about here, right? Most people lived on farmhouses because everybody had to gather food. They couldn't grow as much food. But now that you can grow a lot more food, because if you use a machine, you can gather much more food, that allows people to live in city houses, and not everybody has to be a farmer. Let's take a look at a video of a machine that is harvesting a crop. So here we have the crop here, looks like wheat, and we have a harvester. This machine is called a harvester. And it's coming along and it's gathering up all the wheat, and you can see it's chopping it up and it's putting it up on the back of the machine. And basically what it's doing, it's gathering all of this wheat by machine. And obviously that machine just went through this field really fast. It would take a much, much longer time for a person to do the same thing by hand. So machines have made it possible for us to grow larger and larger amounts of food very quickly. Okay, let's go over our word matching exercise, right? We're going to match the words to their different definitions. Our words are life, dress, shelter, shelter, clothing, clothing, crop, crop, and farm, farm. That's easy. Okay, let's take a look at the definitions. A place to live or to stay. Which place is a place to live or stay? Now you could say farm. You could live on a farm, true, but more general, more broad. Any place to live or to stay is a shelter. And remember, there's many types of shelters. Apartments, houses, farms are shelters. But when we say a place to live or stay, we want the general word. We want the big word. We want to go for shelter. That's more appropriate. Okay. The way a person lives. The way a person lives, we talked about that a little bit. That's the life, right? The life of a person or lifestyle of a person is the way that a person lives. 3, coverings that people wear. So we put things over our body. We cover our bodies with these things. This is called, of course, clothing. Okay, let's move on to number 4. A plant that people grow as food. So when we grow plants for food, what do we call those? There are special kinds of plants, right? Not all plants are crops. If we go out in the forest, right, and we see weeds growing, those aren't crops. A tree, that's not a crop, right? It's only the plants that we grow as food. And I just gave you the idea. I just gave you the answer. It's a crop, right? So crops, those are plants that people grow as food. Trees are not crops. Weeds are not crops. Only things like wheat, rice, corn, cucumbers, tomatoes. Those plants that we eat as food, those are crops. Okay, number 5. A piece of land where people grow crops or animals. That's much more specific, isn't it? That's farm, right? A farm, sure. A farm can be a shelter. We can live on a farm. But very specifically, a farm is a piece of land where people grow crops or animals. That is a farm. Number 6. A type of clothing for women and girls. Remember we talked about this? A long time ago, women only wore this type of clothing, typically wore this type of clothing. That would be a dress. So women wore dresses much more commonly in the past. Okay, nowadays people wear t-shirts and jeans. Okay, let's take a look at our chart here. Different and the same. How are things different and how are they the same? Of course, in the past and in the present. So here we have in the past, and we're talking also about the present, okay? We're talking about different things. What we're doing here is we see women working. This is the same 2 pictures we saw at the beginning of this unit, right? So these 2 pictures are talking about how women work or where women work. These 2 pictures are different. It's the first time we saw them. Looks like they're playing a game here and they're playing a game here. So how have these 2 different things, these different activities, changed from the past to the present? Let's start off with working place for women. In the past, women worked at home. So women worked at home in the past. Today, nowadays, both women and men have jobs outside the home. So that's a big difference, isn't it, between the past. In the past, women only worked at home. It was not acceptable for women to work outside of the home. It was very rare. Most women worked at home. But nowadays, it's very common for women and men to work outside the home, especially in offices and things like that. So that's a big difference from the past to the present. That shows a big difference. How about games? Some of the games children played in the past have stayed the same. So some of the games that children were playing in the past, they're the same as the games that they play nowadays. So that has stayed the same. So basically we see one big difference, and over here we see something that has stayed the same. It's a good expression. It has stayed the same. It has not changed. Okay, let's take a look at the pictures here. We're going to fill in the blank to complete the sentences, or the sentence, only one sentence. The way people live has what. Okay, if we take a look at these two pictures here, we can see that in this picture there are different people. They're doing different things. They're writing down with a feather, not a pen. This person here is sewing something, sewing the clothes together. Look at the style of clothing. A lot of clothing, very old-fashioned. Now take a look at over here. These two women are not working in the house. They're working in an office. Their style of clothing has changed. They're not wearing dresses. They're wearing business suits, female business suits. So the way people live has done what? It's really changed, hasn't it? The way people live has changed from the past to the present. Okay, let's take a look at our true-false questions. Number 1, a shelter is a covering that people wear. Remember we talked about this? I made a comparison between shelter and something else, right? But be careful. Both things protect us from the environment, but we live in one place and we wear another thing. So, do we wear a shelter? That would be very heavy, right? If we wore an apartment or a house. We don't wear a shelter, right? We live in a shelter. So this sentence is not true. It's false. If we change it, if we say clothing, and we don't say a clothing, say clothing. Clothing is non-count. So we say clothing is a covering or coverings, we'd have to change that, coverings that people wear. Clothing is coverings that people wear. Then that would be true, but we have to make a lot of changes to the sentence, so it's false. Number 2, a farm is the gathering of the crops. Does that sound right? Is a farm an event? No, a farm is a place. It's not an event. Gathering the crops is an event. And besides, it's not right. A farm is where you grow crops, but a farm is not a gathering of the crops. That's not true. It's false, right? If we change it, though, and say a harvest, if we change it to that, a harvest is the gathering of the crops, that's true. But again, we have to change the sentence to make it true. Let's take a look at number 3. Flour is made from wheat. Does that sound correct to you guys? Remember I taught you guys that word grind. Grind. When you grind, you rub something together. You rub it with a lot of pressure, and you break it down into smaller pieces. You grind wheat, and what do you get? Yeah, you get flour. So flour is made from wheat. That is true. Okay? Okay, so those are our 3 sentences, true and false sentences. We're going to take a short break now. We're going to come back and take a look at the reading. Don't go anywhere. Okay, welcome back. Let's do the reading section together. Now again, we're talking about changes in family life. So we're talking about how things have changed from the past to the present. And that's what this reading passage will be about. Let's take a look. Life in the past was harder for people. Well, that's true, isn't it? It was much harder to live in the past than it is to live now. The way people live now has changed, but some things are also similar. That's our topic sentence right there, right? The way people live now has changed, but some things are also similar. Of course, contrasting it with life in the past. So basically, this reading passage is going to talk about how some things have changed, but also how some things have stayed similar. Let's take a look. People in the past and now need food, shelter, and clothing. So that's kind of the way things have stayed the same, right? People in the past and now, so both periods of time, we need food, we need shelter, we need clothing. Those things have stayed the same. Those needs have stayed the same. So it's interesting to note that they're going to talk about 1, 2, and 3 things in this reading passage. And usually, and that's the way this reading passage is, if you say the first thing first, food, talk about food first. If your second item is shelter, then talk about shelter second. If your third thing is clothing, then talk about clothing third and last. It's the last thing here. So the order in which you list the items, also keep that same order in which you write about those items if you're writing. And most good writing is based on this type of organizational rule. Okay, so first we saw food is first. We're going to talk about food first. Sure enough, corn and wheat are kinds of crops. That's talking about food. So corn and wheat are kinds of crops. At harvest time, these crops are gathered. Okay, so we're still talking about food. We're talking about how we gather these foods, right? That has stayed the same. But the difference is, in the past, on farms, people harvested crops using their hands. So in the past, people harvested using their hands. Now, people have machines to help them, and the work has become easier. So the difference is now, in the past as opposed to now. There is a difference. People have machines, so we use machines to help them, and the work has become easier. So that's the difference. Before, in the past, people used their hands to gather food. Now, people use machines to help them, and of course, the work has become much easier, much faster, and very important, fewer people have to do that work. So more people can live away from farms. Okay, that's talking about food. Now, the second thing we saw was shelter, and that's the second thing we're going to talk about here. Shelter has also changed, so that's our next subject, the difference between the past and the present. Shelter has also changed. In the past, so that's in the past, we're talking about the past there, people lived in small houses. So in the past, people lived in small houses. That was the past. Now, here we have now, people also live in apartments. Also live. They notice that they use also. That means they still live, some people still live in small houses, but they also live in apartments now. Apartments are much more common nowadays than they were a long time ago in the past. Okay, so that's interesting. The use of also indicates that people still live in small houses. And that's true, of course. People do still live in small houses, but they also live in apartments. That's the second thing, shelter. The third thing we were talking about is clothing. And sure enough, here we talk about clothing. Our clothing has changed. Women in the past, again, in the past, wore dresses. They wore dresses only, right? Women today, okay, that's now, right? Women today wear many different kinds of colorful and interesting clothes. So the difference, of course, in the past, women wore dresses. Today, they wear many different kinds of colorful and interesting clothes, right? So that's interesting there. Not just dresses. There's lots of different kinds of colorful and interesting clothing that women wear these days. So this passage is talking about some of the differences, of course, some of the similarities as well. Okay, so now we've come to our reading skill, and our reading skill is compare and contrast, and of course that's very appropriate for our reading passage, because in the reading passage we were talking about in the past and now, or today. So we can very easily compare and contrast the two time periods. Here in our chart, we can see the past is over here, the present is over here. We have 1, 2, 3 things that are different, right, that we contrast, and one thing down here that are similar that we can compare, right? So let's take a look at these. We need to fill in the details with these words down here. Our words are shelter, easier, apartments, clothing, and only. Let's see how they are different. Okay, first of all, in the past, people harvested crops using the hands, right? Very difficult work. In the present, harvest crops using machines. So work has become what? Well, of course, if you use a machine to do your work has become much what? Shelter, easier, apartments, clothing, or only? Well, of course, you probably should choose easier because that's our comparative, right? So work has become easier, okay? You use machines, work has become easier than in the past when people used their hands. Okay, let's move on. In the past, people lived in small houses. They lived in small houses. In the present, people live in beep. What do people live in now? They live in shelter? Well, small houses is also shelter. Apartments, clothing, or only? Apartments, of course, is our answer here. People live in apartments. They still do live in small houses, that's true, but it's more common, especially in some countries, to live in apartments more than just small houses. Okay, over here. Women wore dresses in the past. Women wore dresses what? Shelter, clothing, or only? We saw that before. Women wore dresses only. They only wore dresses in the past. But now, in the present, women wear many colorful and interesting clothes. Many colorful and interesting clothes, not just dresses, right? So that's a difference. These are all differences. What's something similar? People need food, beep, and beep. What do people need in the past? And they need the same thing in the present. Well, of course we need food. We've always needed food. We've always needed shelter. And we've always needed clothing. So these three things, food, shelter, and clothing, have not changed, right? People need food, shelter, and clothing. That hasn't changed from the past to the present. That remains the same. What has changed is how we get those things or where we get those things, right? We've changed the way that we get our food, how we get our food. We've changed, some people, a lot of people have changed where they live, and a lot of people have changed what they wear. In fact, everybody has changed what they wear, right? Fashion changes very quickly. So even though we need these things, they still have changed in their style or their type, right? But it's true, we still need food, shelter, and clothing, and that's been true for all of history. Okay. Let's take a look here at the reading comprehension questions, okay? We need to fill in the blanks with these words down here. Number one, beep, okay, is something that people wear on their bodies. What do you wear on your body? What do you put on your body to protect you? Do you wear shelter? Well, we talked about that before, right? That would be very silly. It would be very heavy to wear shelter. We wear clothing, don't we? We wear clothing is something that people wear on their bodies. We don't wear flour, right? Unless you're having a fight with your brother and you throw flour, and then you might be wearing flour on your head or your torso, right? But your mom doesn't like that. Don't wear flour. She'll get very angry. You should wear clothing, okay? Do not wear flour on your body. Okay. Number two, crops are gathered. When are crops gathered? When do you gather crops? Do you gather crops at an apartment? Do you gather crops at a shelter? Or do you gather crops at harvest time? By the way, it's interesting to notice, at can be used for both place and time. At can be used for places and time. These two are places, aren't they? These are places. This is a time. It says time right there. Time. So we use at for places and time. But think about it. Crops are gathered at an apartment. Do people grow crops at an apartment? That's silly. That's strange. Of course they don't. Do people grow crops at a shelter? A shelter is a type of apartment. So no, again, you wouldn't do that. Many people live in houses. They don't grow crops at their houses, right? But crops are gathered at harvest time, sure. Yeah, that's true. At the harvest time, that's when the crops are ready, the food is ready, the plants are ready to be eaten, so people will gather the crops. But it's interesting to notice that at is used for both places and time. The party is at my house, right? Or we will gather at 8 o'clock. So we use either at with places and with times. But in this case, we're looking for the time, we're not looking for the place. Okay, let's move on to number three. Crops like corn and wheat are types of crops. What is true about these crops? That's what we're looking for in A, B, and C. We're looking for a true statement about these. A, crops like corn and wheat are grown on farms and are gathered. Is that true? Yeah, absolutely that's true. We talked about that. Where are crops grown on farms? They are gathered. We just talked about harvest time. They are gathered. Let's look at B and C for practice. B, crops like corn and wheat can only be gathered by hand, not by machines. No, that doesn't make sense because we talked about in the modern times. Now, today, we use machines. So crops can absolutely be gathered by machines. Crops are grown in shelters and are gathered. Crops are not grown in shelters, they're grown outdoors, right? They're not grown in shelters. So again, of course, we can see that A is the only correct answer for this one. Number four, in the past, people lived in small houses. And but. We're looking for a true statement. Let's check them out. A, and now they only live in farmhouses. Do people only live in farmhouses? It's true that people do live in farmhouses right now, that's true, but not only. People live in a lot of different places, apartments, suburbs where there are no farms, right? They live in office towns, you know, they live in many different types of housing, many different types of shelters, not only farmhouses, so that's incorrect. Next one, B, and now they also live in apartments. In the past, people lived in small houses, and now they also live in apartments. So also means they live in small houses, but also live in apartments. Is that true? Yeah, we talked about that in the reading passage. I noted the fact that the word also means that they still live in small houses, but now they also live in apartments as well. Let's just look at C. But people no longer need to live in shelters. That's not true. We need shelters, right? That's one of the main things that we were talking about in the reading passage. So of course that's not correct. B is the only correct answer for this question. Okay, let's move on to our chart that we saw before, right? This is our chart that shows what has changed in family life. Wow, it's a big chart, right? We've got all these different things, okay? So we see dress, t-shirt and jeans, farmhouse, city house, harvesting by hand, harvesting by machine. So what's our first blank here? We can talk about past. This is in the past. These are things that are true for the past. How did people dress? Where did they live? And how did they gather their food, or how did they get their food? That's in the past. What do these pictures show? These pictures show, of course, the present, right? These pictures show the present. So there's a difference between the past and the present in 3 categories. So when we're talking about dresses, we're talking about t-shirt and jeans. These are coverings that people wear to cover their body. What are we talking about? We're talking about clothing. Clothing, right? Over here, farmhouse and city houses. These show where people live to protect themselves from the environment. When we talk about where people live, what are we talking about? We're talking about shelter. Where do people live? Where do they go to live? Where do they stay? Basically, we stay in shelters. Over here, harvesting by hand, harvesting by machine. What are we harvesting? What is this thing that we are gathering? Of course, we're talking about food. Okay, so this fills our chart. Kind of interesting that we filled in the categories, not the subjects, but you know, we can go both ways. Okay, so in the past, dresses were different than in the present. Clothing was different. In the past, shelter was different than the present. And in the past, food, the way to get food is different, was different in the past than it is in the present. So basically, this is kind of a very broad or very a unit that covers a lot of different subjects, right? Basically, we're talking about changes in family life. We're talking about 3 main categories or 3 main areas, how life or lifestyles have changed from the past to the present. We were talking about clothing, that women usually wore dresses, but now people wear t-shirts and jeans. We talked about shelter. Many people lived in farmhouses, but now we live in city houses and apartments. We talked about how to gather food. Before, people gathered food by hand. Now they use machines to gather their food, and of course that allows people to live in a lot of different places. By the way, we don't just use machines to gather food. A big difference between the present and the past is we use machines for almost everything these days, and that has made our life a lot easier. Not just for food, but also for many, many different types of work, right? So anyway, this unit was kind of interesting, comparing how people lived in the past to how people live in the present. Okay, that wraps it up for this lesson. We'll see you guys next time. Take care.